She was the only Roman empress executed for adultery, not just for having lovers, but for having dozens. Openly, fearlessly. Valeria Messalina turned desire into a weapon and the imperial bed into her battlefield. She didn't apologize. She didn't hide. And that terrified Rome. So they erased her. No trial, no tomb, just a name whispered in shame, because she dared to rule through the one thing men couldn't control: lust. She was not born to be forgotten. Valeria Messalina came into the world somewhere between the years 17 and 20 AD. The exact date uncertain. As if even history hesitated to begin the story of a woman it would later try so hard to erase. But her bloodline was anything but vague. She was a direct descendant of the revered Claudian family, a niece to one emperor, a cousin to another, and linked by blood to Augustus himself, the founding father of the Roman Empire. From her very first breath, Messalina belonged to the heart of Rome's golden lineage. Yet her fate would play out like a tragedy penned by its darkest poets. She was raised behind high marble walls where olive branches swayed outside shaded atriums, and tutors whispered Greek philosophy while court gossip trickled in from every corner. She learned early, too early, that silence was currency, that beauty was armor, and that ambition, if worn wrong, could slit your throat more effectively than any blade. In a world where women were expected to be vessels of virtue or pawns of politics, Messalina's destiny was sealed before she ever had the chance to choose it. At approximately the age of 14 or 15, still in the flush of girlhood, her voice likely still soft with the uncertainty of youth, she was married to Claudius, a man more than 3 decades her senior, an uncle figure in her extended family, a man who had spent most of his life mocked for his stutter, his limp, his awkward intellect, and his status as the harmless Claudian. To many in Rome, Claudius was the fool no one feared, the scholar emperor who read more than he ruled. But he was also the one who, through a series of palace twists and imperial corpses, had stumbled into power. And when Claudius became emperor in 41 AD, Messalina, still barely 17, became Empress of Rome, the most powerful woman in the known world. But to call this a love story would be a lie. There was no romance in the marriage, no gentle weaving of souls or meeting of minds. Messalina didn't ascend beside Claudius. She was thrown onto the throne like a rose into a storm, admired for her petals but never spared from the wind. To the Roman court, she was a decorative presence, a beautiful shadow trailing a clumsy man. But to those who looked closer, beneath the layers of silk and protocol, Messalina was something else entirely. She was watching, calculating, learning the rules of a game she had no choice but to play. Rome, the eternal city, was a jungle dressed in marble. Senators and generals smiled with bloody teeth, slaves and spies moved behind curtains, and the imperial palace, despite its splendor, was a place where the cost of a misstep could be your life. Messalina, thrust into that world before her mind or heart had fully formed, realized something chilling. Survival in Rome's elite wasn't about virtue or piety. It was about proximity to power, and how effectively you could bend that power to your will. And so she adapted. She wore the purple robes, accepted the tributes, and walked in the rituals of matronly modesty. But beneath her veil of propriety, Messalina began to understand the paradox that had long governed Roman womanhood. That the closer a woman got to power, the more invisible she had to become. She was praised for her beauty, but not for her voice. Admired for her youth, but not for her mind. They wanted a statue, not a strategist. But Messalina had no interest in being made of stone. She was born with the kind of face that made poets weep and painters dream. Wide eyes, delicate bone structure, full lips that curved easily into a smirk or silence. And that face, she discovered, was a key. When she spoke, men listened politely. When she looked, men lingered. But when she touched, they obeyed. It wasn't love that moved them. It was awe, hunger, and fear. And Messalina learned to wield that mixture like a sword. In a court where men took mistresses freely, kept slaves for pleasure, and boasted of their nightly exploits in wine-soaked banquets, Messalina's own sexuality was never supposed to be a weapon. But that's exactly what she made it. She understood something her male counterparts never considered. That desire, when used precisely, could shift alliances, ignite ambition, or unravel empires. And so she began to construct a network, not of scrolls and senators, but of glances and whispers, of rendezvous and secrets. It started quietly. A glance across a courtyard, a hand brushed against a toga in the hallway, a midnight visitor who left before sunrise. These were not lovers in the traditional sense. They were pieces, pawns. Some she favored, others she fed to the rumor mill. Each encounter, each conquest, was a strand in the web she spun around the imperial court. And while Claudius busied himself with books, reforms, and cautious governance, Messalina was turning the palace into her own theater of influence. Still, the pressure never eased. The same eyes that watched her rise also waited for her to fall. Every step she took was watched. Every whisper she shared was weighed. She lived in luxury, but slept in danger. Her rivals, older women of the court, suspicious generals, even her own family, saw her as a threat cloaked in perfume. To them, Messalina was too visible, too confident, too alive. But she would not shrink. If Rome wouldn't let her rule openly, she would rule through shadows. If her voice was ignored, she would use her body. If love was a trap, she would bait it. She played a role written for her by a patriarchal empire, and then she rewrote it with blood and pleasure. To some, she was a harlot. To others, a heroine. To many, an enigma. And so the girl who married an emperor before she had finished growing, who wore the crown before she could fully understand its weight, began a dangerous journey not into romance, but into survival, where every touch was a tactic, every sigh a strategy, and every night could be her last. Because in Rome, power seduced everyone. But for a woman to seduce power, that was unforgivable. They called her the most beautiful woman in Rome, and for a time, that seemed to be enough. Crowned empress while barely past girlhood, Messalina walked through the halls of the Palatine Palace, not as a girl, not as a queen, but as a living contradiction. Worshipped for her youth and beauty, feared for her sudden influence, envied for her status, and yet utterly alone in a world built by men. For men, to be ruled by men who believed that a woman's smile should be sweet, her voice soft, and her ambition non-existent. Inside the gilded cage of Roman luxury, where mosaic floors reflected candlelight like stars fallen to earth, and servants stood so still they might as well have been carved from marble, Messalina began to understand that power granted to a woman was not the same as power earned by a man. It was not respected, not secure, not truly hers. It was lent to her, conditionally, cruelly, and always under surveillance. The moment she stepped too far, too fast, too boldly, it could be ripped away, not with a shout, but with a whisper, not with a sword, but with silence. To the Senate, to the generals, to the old aristocrats in their ivory villas, she was a passing delight, a fleeting bloom on the imperial branch, something to be admired from afar and discarded when the season changed. She was the emperor's young wife, yes, but no one asked what she thought, what she wanted, or what she feared. They asked only, what did she wear, who did she look at, and did she know her place? She did, and then she decided not to stay there. Messalina soon realized that her beauty, her charm, even her youth were not weaknesses to be hidden or dulled, but tools to be sharpened, honed, and used with precision. She was not naive. She knew that in a city where power passed through the hands of men like wine at a feast, she had no seat at the table. So she built her own behind the curtain, where the real games were played. Because she understood, far earlier than most, that in Rome, the battlefield was not only the Senate floor or the front lines of war, it was the bedroom, the banquet, the back channel. And in that dangerous arena, she would not only survive, she would dominate. It began subtly, as all revolutions do. A glance that lingered longer than protocol allowed. A conversation with a visiting noble that went beyond mere pleasantries. A servant dismissed early. A senator's aide summoned late. The empress began to cultivate a reputation not just as a consort, but as a force, silent, seductive, and ever watching. And the men around her, so used to wielding power, so rarely challenged by a woman who could hold their gaze and return it with meaning, began to respond. Some with fear, some with fascination, most with a fatal combination of both. They underestimated her, and in doing so, walked willingly into her orbit. They brought her secrets, they brought her whispers, and some, too hungry or too foolish, brought their allegiance. But Messalina was not reckless. Not yet. She knew the lines she walked were thin as silk, and though she was adored by many, she was protected by few. The imperial court was a labyrinth of treachery wrapped in ritual. One misstep, one rumor, one wrong name on one wrong tongue, and even the empress could be dragged from her pedestal and flung into the shadows. So she chose her moments carefully, masked her intentions with mirth, and turned every compliment into a transaction, every touch into a promise, every silence into a negotiation. Still, the eyes never left her. When she appeared at ceremonies, flanked by Claudius and their son Britannicus, draped in imperial purple and crowned with golden laurels, the crowd would cheer, but the applause always carried a second meaning. To the public, she was an icon. To the aristocracy, a liability. To the palace slaves, she was a mystery wrapped in perfume and silk. Some loved her, many loathed her, but all watched, always watched. They whispered behind veils and columns. Too bold, too confident, too much. They measured her steps like a general counts the enemy's horses, searching for weakness, for fatigue, for the precise moment when she would go too far. But Messalina, who had learned to read faces before she learned to read scrolls, saw through their performance and played her part to perfection. She was laughter at banquets, piety at temples, devotion beside Claudius's throne, and yet, beneath it all, a pulse of defiance beat quietly within her. Because what they never understood, what Rome could never allow itself to understand, was that Messalina did not crave attention for its own sake. She craved freedom. Not the abstract kind sung in odes or sculpted in stone, but the tangible kind. The freedom to move without permission, to speak without censure, to love without punishment. And in a world where men built their legacies on blood and conquest, she dared to dream of building hers on pleasure and persuasion. But pleasure is power, and power, when wielded by a woman, is always seen as threat. And so the cage around her, though gilded, though praised, though cloaked in every indulgence, tightened day by day. Even as she rose, even as she danced through the corridors of influence with the grace of a priestess and the cunning of a senator, Messalina could feel the net around her slowly pulling taut. Every move brought her closer to the edge. Every favor asked, every ally gained, every night spent in secret rooms drew lines on a map no one had given her permission to redraw. Still, she didn't stop. Because Messalina understood something primal and terrifying. In a world where women were bought and bartered like land and cattle, the only way to escape being a possession was to become a player. And if she had to use the currency of beauty, the theater of desire, the illusion of submission, so be it. She would speak in the only language men couldn't resist. And when they leaned in to listen, she would rewrite the script. But power earned in shadows is never safe for long. And in the dark corridors of the Palatine, where secrets rot and ambition feeds, the rumors were beginning to grow teeth. The stories began quietly. Hushed voices behind wine cups, a slip of parchment passed under a table, the idle mutter of a senator's wife pretending not to know what she absolutely knew. And yet, like smoke rising from a crack in the earth, the rumors of Empress Messalina's lovers began to coil around the marble columns of the Palatine Hill, staining the walls with implications no imperial decree could scrub clean. At first it was dismissed as court gossip, the usual jealousies of bored elites and paranoid men with too much power and too little purpose. A smear campaign crafted to humiliate the young empress who dared to wield influence with a smile instead of a sword. But then came the names, too specific to ignore, too frequent to deny, too dangerous to explain away. A provincial governor here, a former consul there, a playwright known for his tragedies, a nobleman with a history of debt suddenly cleared, and a rising general whose career ascended faster than his merit justified. These were not just men seduced for pleasure. They were pieces on a board, selected, placed, and moved by a woman who understood that in Rome, alliances were not sealed with handshakes, but with secrets shared in candlelight, with promises made in breathless whispers, with loyalty bought not with gold, but with the illusion of love. Because for Messalina, desire was never simply about lust. It was about leverage. Every lover was a potential informant, a protector, a sword drawn in her name or a shield raised in her defense. And as she weaved her web of influence across Rome's ruling class, it became clear that she was not merely indulging in private affairs. She was building something. A shadow network. A system of men who owed her favors, feared her touch, or fantasized about her approval. Men who would risk their reputation, their marriages, their positions, sometimes even their lives, to remain in her good graces. A network that operated in the gaps of official power, just beneath the surface of law and order, where Rome's real heart beat in scandal, ambition, and the quiet terror of being exposed. And while Claudius sat on his throne, mumbling over legal reforms and imperial appointments, Messalina was mapping the veins of the empire through silk sheets and side doors, knowing which senator could be swayed with a look, which general could be distracted with a caress, which magistrate feared her enough to do exactly as she asked. But with every new conquest, with every whispered name added to the growing list of alleged lovers, the danger deepened, not just because of what she was doing, but because of who was watching. The palace buzzed with informants, and the streets of Rome, filled with statues and shadows, carried information like blood through a body. Inevitable, unstoppable, and always flowing toward the heart of power. What Messalina failed to see, or perhaps refused to acknowledge, was that her network, brilliant as it was, could never remain invisible forever. Because in Rome, nothing threatened the powerful more than a woman who didn't beg for permission. And so, while she slept in the arms of ambitious men and smiled her way through official functions with the grace of a goddess and the strategy of a chess master, the walls around her began to whisper louder, and the glances lingered longer. Not with admiration, but suspicion. Behind her back, former allies began to distance themselves. Husbands warned their wives not to attend her dinners. Senators who once praised her beauty now questioned her virtue. And those who had once benefited from her generosity began to weigh the cost of continued loyalty against the rising tide of scandal. Still, she pressed forward. Because Messalina, having survived the worst Rome had to offer, its judgment, its envy, its double standards, knew that retreat was not survival, that hesitation invited attack, and that to stop now would be to admit everything they feared was true. So she doubled down. She hosted lavish feasts under the full moon, where wine flowed like a second bloodstream and music masked the murmur of secrets traded in every corner. She arranged marriages, brokered deals, manipulated promotions, and rewarded silence with access. And all the while, she painted herself as the dutiful wife and mother, a portrait of Roman virtue draped in gold and scandal. Yet beneath the splendor, the cracks were beginning to show. Some of her lovers grew too bold, mistaking her attention for affection, her power for possession, and began to make demands she could not fulfill, or worse, boasts they could not take back. Others, jealous or frightened, or simply exhausted by the duplicity, began to talk, quietly at first, then more openly, as if confessing would absolve them of the guilt they were too cowardly to carry. And in the dark corners of the palace, those whispers began to take shape, not as stories, but as accusations. The line between truth and rumor blurred, and soon no one could say with certainty how many men had shared the Empress's bed, nor what they had been promised in return. But that ambiguity only made the story more powerful, more salacious, more dangerous. Because in a world ruled by perception, Messalina was no longer just a woman. She was a myth, a threat, a mirror held up to the empire's own hypocrisy. For while Roman men flaunted their mistresses, visited brothels, and sired children out of wedlock without consequence, Messalina was condemned for daring to play the same game. Because the sin was never lust, but female agency. She had broken the unspoken rule that a woman could be desired, but never desiring, admired, but never in control, worshipped, but never feared. And so the network that once protected her, lifted her, shielded her from consequence, began to collapse. One man at a time, one whisper at a time, one betrayal at a time. Because in Rome, power without discretion was a death sentence. And for Messalina, every lover was now a liability. It was the kind of story so obscene, so impossible, so soaked in scandal and male fear, that it should have died out the moment it was whispered. But instead, it lived on. Not just as gossip, not just as legend, but as a defining moment in the way history chose to remember her. Not for her lineage, not for her power, not even for her betrayal of an emperor, but for the night she challenged a prostitute to a contest of endurance and won. According to the historian Juvenal, never known for kindness toward women, let alone women who dared to step beyond the lines etched by patriarchy, Messalina, Empress of Rome, wife to Claudius, mother to a son destined for the throne, once disguised herself and slipped into the Lupanar, the city's most infamous brothel. Not as a guest, not as a voyeur, but as a participant, ready to test herself in a game that no emperor had ever imagined his wife would play. The challenge was simple in design, grotesque in implication. How many men could one woman take in a single night? Her opponent was Scylla, a well-known prostitute of exceptional stamina, someone who had built her career not on charm or appearance, but on the brutal logistics of pleasure as commodity. And yet even she, hardened by years in Rome's most unforgiving beds, could not keep up with the Empress. By sunrise, Scylla was exhausted, swollen, barely conscious. And Messalina, they said, was still unsatisfied. The final number? 25, according to the most circulated version, though some sources suggest more, others fewer, and most admit they don't really know. But that hardly mattered, because the number was never the point. The point was this: she outlasted a professional. She didn't collapse. She didn't repent. She didn't even hide. She simply stood, straightened her robes, returned to the palace, and carried on being Empress, as if the night's events had been no more unusual than a stroll in the imperial garden. And in that moment, whether the story was true, half-true, or a complete fabrication, the legend of Messalina passed beyond the reach of historians and entered the bloodstream of Roman memory, where it fermented into a toxic myth. The woman who wanted too much, dared too much, became too much. To some, it was proof of her moral depravity, a symbol of how far she had fallen from the ideals of matronly dignity and domestic virtue that Roman women were expected to uphold. To others, it was a form of horrifying admiration, a tale told with awe and disbelief, as if her ability to endure pleasure were somehow indistinguishable from power itself. But to Messalina, if she ever truly did it, and perhaps she did, because it was just mad enough to be real. It was never about lust, and it certainly wasn't about fun. It was about control. Because for all the men who thought they could use her, buy her, shame her, define her, it was she who had flipped the script, turned herself into something that frightened them more than any battlefield defeat. A woman whose appetite could not be quenched, whose body could not be owned, whose spirit would not beg for approval. She had done the unthinkable, entered a world designed for male indulgence, outperformed one of its champions, and returned unscathed. But Rome did not take kindly to women who humiliated its myths. And in the weeks and months that followed, the story spread like rot in a basket of figs, picked up by poets, twisted by senators, exaggerated by slaves, until it became impossible to separate the woman from the metaphor, the truth from the warning, the empress from the harlot they desperately wanted her to be. Because that's what the brothel story offered Rome, a convenient explanation for everything they feared about Messalina. Her ambition, her intelligence, her audacity, all boiled down to one word they could repeat like a curse and a verdict in the same breath: whore. And if she was that, if she was no different from the women who worked the lupanar, who opened their legs for coin and closed their mouths for safety, then they didn't have to take her seriously. They didn't have to see her as a politician or a strategist or a woman who had understood Rome's system better than most men born into it. They could dismiss her. They could laugh. They could kill her. And even if the story had been planted by her enemies, even if it had been twisted by centuries of repetition, it stuck, because it was precisely the kind of story that Roman men loved to tell. A morality tale wrapped in sexual panic, a warning wrapped in a sneer. But what they failed to see, what they perhaps refused to admit even to themselves, was that the Messalina who might have walked into that brothel who might have locked eyes with Scylla and said, "Let's see who breaks first," was not a fallen woman. She was a warrior, not one armed with steel or shield, but with skin, voice, and unrelenting defiance. She had entered the one arena where men thought they held absolute dominion, where women were object, not actor. And she had turned it into her Colosseum. Because in a world where a general could be celebrated for slaughter, a senator could be honored for bribery, and an emperor could collect mistresses like trophies without consequence, Messalina's greatest crime was never her body. It was that she used it the way men used swords. With intent, with skill, with zero remorse. If the whispers of lovers and scandal had once coiled like smoke around Messalina, suggestive and elusive, then her affair with Gaius Silius did something far more dangerous. It gave shape to the fire. Because Silius was not just another name in a long list of fleeting indulgences, not just a knight of distraction or a pawn in her courtly intrigue. He was young, handsome, politically ambitious, and worst of all, unmarried. Until Messalina ordered him to divorce his wife so he could belong to her completely, so she could mold him into something more than a secret, a partner, a public symbol, a possible path to something even more unthinkable than adultery. Replacement. And so began the most fatal chapter of Messalina's rule, not because it was reckless in passion, though it certainly was that, but because for the first time, her private appetite merged fully with her public ambition. And the result was a conspiracy so brazen, so intoxicating, so wildly self-destructive, that even her former allies began to wonder whether she had finally crossed the invisible line Rome always drew for women. The point at which desire ceased to be a game and became a declaration of war. Silius, for all his qualities, was not Claudius. He was youthful where the emperor was aged, eloquent where Claudius stammered, confident where the throne-bearer still second-guessed himself. And Messalina, who had spent years wrapping herself in veils of pretense and diplomacy, found in him not just pleasure, but potential. A man through whom she could rewrite the script of her life, through whom she could finally shed the mask of the submissive wife and step into the role she had always understood herself to be worthy of. A ruler, or at least the architect behind one. It wasn't enough to be empress anymore. She wanted control. And so while Claudius busied himself with legal minutiae, lost in scrolls and stuttering through public declarations, Messalina and Silius began moving through the city like shadows made flesh, meeting under columns and behind locked doors, speaking in codes, exchanging more than touches and kisses, whispering of succession, of legitimacy, of the terrifying possibility that Claudius could be replaced. But it was not whispers that doomed them. It was the wedding. In the year 48 AD, while Claudius had left Rome on official duties, Messalina made a choice so staggering, so openly treasonous, that even her enemies blinked in disbelief. She married Silius in a public ceremony. Whether out of lust, madness, political calculation, or sheer arrogance, no one could quite agree, but the fact remained. Rome's empress wed another man while the emperor still lived. It was not a private farce. It was not a hidden ritual. It was a Roman wedding, complete with witnesses, guests, and oaths. An act so defiant, so legally and symbolically potent, that it could only be interpreted one way, as a coup in motion. And in Rome, a coup, even one whispered through rose petals and consummated in silk, was a death sentence. The palace, already bloated with suspicion, exploded into panic. Courtiers who had once laughed at Messalina's flirtations now fled her chambers. Allies began purging her name from their letters. Men who had benefited from her favors tore their faces away from her portrait in fear. The woman who had made and unmade careers with the curve of a finger was suddenly a liability too dangerous to be associated with. And all eyes turned to Narcissus. As imperial secretary and one of Claudius's closest freedmen, Narcissus had long watched Messalina with unease, perhaps even disgust. But he had tolerated her influence so long as it remained within the bounds of manageable scandal. Now, with the emperor out of town and news of her marriage to Silius reaching his ears, he understood something that changed the course of Roman history. Messalina wasn't simply indulging herself anymore. She was positioning Silius as Claudius's successor, which meant Claudius had to act immediately. But Claudius, slow, uncertain, always overshadowed by stronger personalities, was not so easily stirred. He had loved Messalina, or at least trusted her. And when Narcissus informed him of the wedding, the emperor reportedly laughed in disbelief, assuming it must be a misunderstanding, or a joke, or some sort of deranged rumor blown out of proportion by enemies of his household. But then Narcissus, with the deadly calm of a man whose career now depended on absolute clarity, ordered Claudius to return to Rome, not with ceremony, but with soldiers. Because the truth was undeniable. Messalina had committed bigamy, yes, but more than that. Treason, whether she intended to crown Silius as emperor or simply live beside him as Rome's unofficial queen. The message was the same. The woman who had once outlasted prostitutes in brothels, who had used her body to reshape the very mechanisms of Roman power, had now decided that being the emperor's wife was not enough. She wanted to rewrite the title page of history, and for that, she would not be forgiven. The wedding, brief as it was, became the centerpiece of her downfall. The smoking gun, the poisoned chalice, the irredeemable act, in a city that had long tolerated her sins, but would not tolerate her ambition. Rome, for all its corruption, had one unspoken rule. The empire could survive immorality, but it could not survive female revolt. And Messalina, by daring to publicly replace her husband, by placing a new man beside her in the sacred space of marriage, by suggesting through action that she could choose her own emperor, had committed an act so terrifying, so revolutionary, that the entire structure of Roman masculinity shuddered under its implications. She had played the game too well. She had reached too high. And now, the knives were being sharpened. It didn't come with trumpets or torches, no formal accusations shouted before the Senate, no honorable confrontation in the forum, no dramatic meeting between husband and wife beneath the towering arches of the palace. No. Messalina's fall began with something far colder, more methodical, more Roman. A whisper passed from Narcissus's lips into the ear of the emperor. A calculated briefing over scrolls and silence. The slow unraveling of one man's trust by another man's fear. Claudius, startled, skeptical, perhaps even confused, had to be shown the truth, not in rhetoric, not in principle, but in detail. Narcissus handed him names, dates, places, described the wedding ceremony like it was a battlefield defeat, laid out the timeline with the precision of a funeral rite. And with every line spoken, the soft denial in Claudius's eyes began to harden into something else. Not anger, not yet, but dread. Because the betrayal wasn't just personal, it was imperial. This wasn't a wife cheating on her husband in the shadows of a villa. This was an empress, a mother of the imperial bloodline, entering into another man's bed and his household and his future, while the emperor himself still lived, still ruled, still issued decrees from the same city where the wedding had taken place. There are few things more terrifying to an emperor than learning he has become irrelevant in his own palace. And Messalina had made him irrelevant. So Narcissus did what many advisors do when they fear their master will hesitate. He moved first. Without waiting for full imperial authorization, without holding debate, he ordered Messalina's network dismantled, piece by piece, man by man. Those who had once toasted her name at banquets now found themselves summoned under false pretenses, interrogated in private, offered clemency in exchange for confessions, or in some cases, not offered anything at all before their heads were taken. Silius, once so bold, so adorned in power and anticipation, now stood in chains, silent and pale, no longer a lover or a conspirator, but a man staring down the cold mouth of execution. And whatever loyalty he might have once held toward Messalina evaporated in the final hours before the blade touched his throat. He confessed to the marriage, to the plan, to everything. And suddenly, Messalina, the woman who had ruled with her smile and survived with her silence, found herself on the wrong side of every door. Her name, once whispered in adoration, was now muttered in meetings as a threat. Her allies vanished. Her protectors fled. Even the men she had once elevated, some through strategy, some through seduction, now spoke of her with practiced indifference, erasing her from their memories before history had the chance to record them alongside her. When the imperial guard came to arrest her, she was not in armor. She was not on horseback, or surrounded by defenders, or cloaked in the purple robes of Roman royalty. She was in her garden, unarmed, unready, alone. No trial was held, no defense was allowed, no plea was heard. This was not justice. This was erasure. The order was simple and brutal. Take her to prison, but not a public one, not a cell for common criminals, for that would still grant her visibility, would still make her a symbol, would still leave room for rumor or redemption. No, Messalina was to be held somewhere quiet, somewhere remote, somewhere far from the eyes of the people who once gasped at her beauty or gossiped about her midnight feasts. She was not to be seen again, not in life, not in mourning, not in stone. They stripped her of her title, erased her name from official scrolls, rescinded her privileges as empress and wife, barred her from her own estate, and sealed her letters unread. She became, in the space of a week, not a person, but a problem to be solved, a shadow to be deleted, a story too dangerous to be told. And in the final insult, one so deeply Roman it carried the sting of ritual, her own son, Britannicus, heir to the empire, was removed from his position as future emperor, not because he had sinned, not because he was guilty, but because he was hers. Because he had come from the body now labeled corrupt, because he had been born from the womb now declared treasonous. And so Messalina, once the most powerful woman in the empire, once the feared and envied and whispered about centerpiece of Rome's most scandalous stories, now sat alone in a private villa turned prison, watched by guards who did not speak to her, delivered food by servants who dared not meet her eyes, surrounded by silence where once there had been song. She wrote letters, begged to see Claudius, pleaded for a final conversation. But Claudius, now too overwhelmed by the storm of voices around him, Narcissus, the Senate, his generals, his freedmen, refused to see her. Perhaps because he couldn't bear to look. Perhaps because he still didn't believe, or perhaps because he did, and it broke him. But either way, the silence held. And Messalina, the woman who had once ruled the city with nothing more than perfume and gaze, now faced the one enemy she had no defense against, the cold machinery of Roman consequence. No poetry, no passion, just protocol and death. It was not the sword that broke her. It was the silence. Because for all the rumors she had survived, all the glances she had turned into weapons, all the nights she had walked the edge between power and scandal without ever slipping, what finally undid Messalina was not humiliation or hatred, or even the sentence of death itself. It was the unbearable, echoing void that followed her final plea. The unanswered letter. The request denied. The message returned without a seal. The aching emptiness where a husband's voice might have been, where a decision might have felt human. She had written him, not once but several times. Her words flowing not with arrogance or seduction this time, but with fear. Raw, immediate, terrifying. Because she knew, in the marrow of her bones, that her life no longer belonged to her. That her name had become poison. That the doors once flung open at her approach were now bolted shut. And that the man she had once called husband, who had once kissed her hand in front of the Senate, would now decide whether she lived or died. Not as a wife, not as a mother, not even as an empress, but as a problem to be eliminated. And she begged. Historians would later paint her as cold, manipulative, a creature of ambition and lust. But in those final days, beneath the crushing weight of abandonment, Messalina became something far more disturbing. Human. She wept. She bargained. She sent her children to plead on her behalf, dressed in white, barefoot, symbols of innocence in a palace that had long forgotten what innocence looked like. And yet Claudius, surrounded by advisors who had spent weeks hardening his heart, never saw them. Perhaps he was afraid to. Perhaps he knew that if he saw her again, if he allowed her voice into his chamber, her eyes into his vision, her tears into his judgment, she might undo him once more, might slip beneath his logic with that same devastating grace, that same unbearable beauty, and remind him of how deeply she had once been woven into the fabric of his life. But he refused. And it was in that refusal, in that single decision to remain unreachable, that the machinery of execution was set into motion, not with a trial, not with a proclamation, but with a simple nod, a muttered instruction, a grim understanding passed between men who had already begun to erase her from their records. The silence, then, was not merely absence. It was verdict. And while Claudius paced in uncertainty, while senators whispered in corners and servants tried to pretend they had never touched her robes or laughed at her jokes, Messalina waited, alone, unarmed. And still, in some corner of her shattered hope, believing he would come, that he would appear, even if only to condemn her with his own lips, even if only to meet her eyes once more and say, "You are no longer mine," because even that would have been mercy compared to the nothingness she received. But no messenger came to deliver pardon. No horses arrived bearing reprieve. No footstep outside her chamber carried the weight of a husband's decision. Only soldiers, only orders, only death. And in that final cruel irony, the woman who had built her power through voice, through visibility, through her ability to command attention in a room filled with gods and generals, was now silenced. Not by argument, not by force, but by being ignored. History would later paint her execution as swift, even honorable. But the truth is messier, more disturbing, more Roman in its cold precision. Because what was done to Messalina was not just an ending. It was a message. carved not into stone but into memory, meant to terrify not only her, but every woman who might one day walk too confidently through the corridors of power. Do not forget, the empire seemed to say, that no matter how high you rise, no matter how many men bow to you, no matter how many doors open in your name, you are never more than a breath away from erasure. The guards who came for her did not announce themselves with ceremony. They did not say her name. They did not offer comfort. They were there to finish what had already been decided in silence, to remove the final living trace of a woman whose mere existence had once made the Senate tremble, and whose destruction would now serve as a balm for Roman masculinity, wounded by her defiance. When she saw them, Messalina did not scream. She did not run. She did not collapse. Instead, she tried, one last time, to send word to Claudius, to remind him of their son, of the years they had shared, of the bed they had once called theirs. But by then, it was too late. The order had been given. The wheels had turned. And what followed was not trial, not spectacle, not even closure, but a quiet descent into something far more terrifying than vengeance. Oblivion. They would not let her speak. They would not let her plead. They would not even let her see the face of the man who condemned her. And so, as she sat in the dim light of a borrowed room, stripped of titles, jewelry, dignity, her name already fading from the scrolls of the empire, Messalina, the woman who had seduced a city and outlived 100 whispers, was left with nothing but the unbearable realization that she would die as she now lived, unacknowledged, not hated, not feared, just forgotten. They did not lead her through the forum or march her past the statues that once bore her likeness. They did not drag her in chains through the palace corridors where she had once reigned in silk. They did not parade her before the crowd, because even in execution, Rome was afraid of what Messalina meant, afraid of what her eyes might still say if they met the eyes of the people. So they took her instead to a private garden near the Aventine Hill, a place chosen not for its beauty, but for its distance, for its silence, for its ability to bury something without ever saying goodbye. It was early morning, the kind of pale Roman light that doesn't warm so much as haunt. And the air still carried the damp breath of the night, clinging to the hedges, the stone, the skin. Because even nature, it seemed, understood that something unnatural was about to happen here. That the killing of an empress outside the law, in secrecy and without defense, was not an execution but a ritual, a quiet, unspoken act of political purification. The soldiers who escorted her said nothing, not because they were cruel, but because they were afraid. Afraid of what it meant to be in her presence. Afraid of what it meant to hold the order of death against someone who had once been so high above them. Afraid of what history would whisper about this day, if it whispered at all. She was handed a dagger. It was not large, not heavy, not meant for war or drama. It was small, intimate, symbolic, the kind of weapon Rome reserved for those deemed worthy of honorable death. A gesture less about mercy and more about control, about making sure the condemned participated in their own erasure, that they knelt and bled by their own hand, so that the empire would not have to stain itself with the final act. Messalina took it, but her fingers trembled, because for all her strength, all her defiance, all her mastery of power and persuasion, she was not a soldier, not a gladiator, not one of the men who spent their lives dancing with death. She was a woman, a mother, a survivor of court and cruelty. And this was not her world. They expected her to plunge the blade into herself, into her throat or chest or belly, to do what so many others had done before her and transform her own death into a moment of Roman dignity. But Messalina, who had survived everything but silence, found that now, in this last request, her hands betrayed her. Her courage faltered. Her knees buckled beneath the weight of the choice. She could not do it. She tried, lifting the dagger, lowering it, pressing it against her skin as if willing herself to vanish, to slip into legend without the mess of screaming or blood. But no matter how tightly she clenched her jaw, how deeply she breathed, the blade would not move. And the guards watched, not with cruelty, not with pity, but with something worse: indifference. Because to them, this was not a person anymore. This was an order, a task, a day's work. And so when it became clear that she would not die by her own hand, one of them, unnamed in the histories, faceless in every account, stepped forward, took the dagger from her fingers, and drove it into her chest. No fanfare, no last words, no witnesses beyond those paid to forget. Just the quiet sound of a body collapsing onto grass, the rustle of fabric folding over a wound, and the faint hiss of a breath that never came back. And when it was done, when the woman who had once made the city blush and tremble and kneel was finally still, the soldiers did not carry her body with reverence or fear. They left her there for a time, to bleed into the dirt, to return to earth without mourning, to disappear not just from Rome, but from memory. There was no funeral, no monument, no ceremony, no Senate declaration, no public acknowledgement that Valeria Messalina had ever worn the purple. Her name was not spoken by those in power. Her image was removed from statues, her likeness from coins, her story from scrolls. Even the place of her burial, if it was marked at all, was forgotten within a generation, because her death was not just a punishment, it was a warning. A lesson carved not in marble, but in silence, that no woman, no matter how beautiful or clever or connected, could seize power in Rome without paying for it with everything: body, blood, and legacy. And yet, there was something that could not be killed. Because even as the empire tried to erase her, even as scribes hesitated to mention her name, even as poets turned their verses to safer subjects, and historians debated whether she had ever been more than a symbol of lust, the people remembered. In taverns and markets, her name was whispered. In alleyways and side streets, her story was told. Half myth, half warning, fully alive. Not as a villain, not as a whore, but as the woman who had once dared to live like the men around her, freely, brazenly, without apology. And that, in the end, was the one thing Rome could never forgive. The death of Messalina should have been the end. Should have closed the book, ended the scandal, silenced the whispers. But in Rome, death was never enough when the offense was unforgettable. And so her execution, violent and hidden and unceremonious as it was, did not satisfy the need to restore control. Because the true crime was not her betrayal of Claudius, nor her appetite for pleasure, nor even the reckless audacity of her public wedding to another man. It was her refusal to stay within the borders drawn for her sex, her status, her role. And for that, Rome demanded something far worse than death. It demanded erasure. They called it damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory. A punishment reserved not for common criminals or rebellious slaves, but for those who had touched power so directly, so dangerously, that their existence had to be scrubbed not only from history, but from the present tense, as if to suggest they had never walked among the living at all. It began with her statues, Not torn down in riotous fury, not shattered in the theater of public outrage, but quietly, methodically, one by one, as if Rome itself were holding its breath, as if her image were too dangerous to destroy in fire or more, and instead needed to be dismantled slowly, with surgical precision. Her marble likenesses were removed from temples and palaces. Her face was chiseled from reliefs and friezes. Her name scratched off dedication stones by workers paid not to ask questions. The coins that bore her image, once symbols of imperial continuity, minted by the thousands, were recalled, melted, replaced with new metal and new names, so that commerce itself would no longer carry her through the fingers of the people. The official archives, so meticulous in their record-keeping, so obsessed with lineage and legitimacy, were revised. Birth records, speeches, decrees, any document in which she had appeared as empress, any letter signed in her hand or issued under her authority, was pulled from storage, adjusted, amended, or quietly destroyed, as if a century of influence could be undone with ink and fire. The scribes who once praised her for loyalty, beauty, or fertility were instructed to write of her no more, and if they did speak of her, it was only in venom. Only as a cautionary tale, a shameful footnote in the reign of Claudius, a reminder that Rome, though powerful, had once been nearly undone by a woman who mistook her reflection for a crown. Even her name, Messalina, was poisoned. Not simply removed, but transformed, rebranded as a curse, a symbol, a slur. To call a woman a Messalina in centuries that followed meant not just that she was promiscuous, but that she was dangerous, corrupt, ambitious in a way that men found intolerable. And her story, stripped of nuance, hollowed of complexity, became a parable taught to wives, repeated by priests, whispered by men who feared what might happen if their own partners ever recognized how little difference there was between imperial Rome and the homes they ruled with their own kinds of law. But damnatio memoriae did not stop with her. It reached beyond the grave, past the marble, past the fire, and into the living. Her son, Britannicus, once hailed as the heir to the empire, the son of the emperor and empress, born of legitimate union, raised in the expectation of greatness, was suddenly not enough, not safe, not clean, because he had come from her, because her blood ran through his veins, because to elevate him would mean that part of her legacy still lived. So Claudius, pressured by his advisors, seduced by palace politics, or simply broken by the emotional shrapnel left behind, married again, this time to his niece, Agrippina the Younger, and adopted her son, Nero, elevating him above Britannicus, securing the line not by love or law, but by forgetting. And thus, the boy who had once been raised to rule was demoted in silence, allowed to live but not to inherit, allowed to breathe but not to ascend. His very existence a walking reminder of a woman Rome would not forgive. He too would die young, poisoned, erased, like his mother, like the truth. And Rome moved on, or pretended to, because even in its silence, even in its redactions, the empire could not fully contain the memory of Messalina. She lingered in the margins of scrolls, in the satire of poets, in the warnings passed between generals and their wives. She reappeared in plays, in statues mistakenly left intact, in the flicker of recognition when a new empress walked too confidently into the room. Her legacy, warped, defiled, misunderstood, remained too potent to vanish, because there was something about her that Rome could not fully destroy, the fears she represented. She had wielded sexuality not as submission, but as strategy, had maneuvered through the politics of men not with brute force or flattery, but with something deeper, An instinct for survival so sharp it had cut through the soft flesh of the patriarchy and left it bleeding on the marble floors of its own palace. And the men who followed, emperors, senators, historians, were forced to confront the uncomfortable fact that her greatest offense had not been her lovers or her wedding or even her betrayal. It was that she had done all of it in plain sight, unapologetically, brilliantly, and for far too long, successfully. She had turned their world inside out and shown them that the rules they held sacred could be rewritten, not by rebellion, not by invasion, but by a woman in silk, whispering in the ears of those who thought they ruled. And that they could never forgive. So they gave her the punishment they reserved for the most dangerous of enemies, not death, but deletion. But what Rome never understood, what tyrants and courts and conquerors still fail to understand, is that the more violently you try to erase someone, the more indelibly they are written into memory. And Messalina, though denied a grave, denied a statue, denied a voice in her own story, remained. In the shadows, in the rumors, in the fear, in the name that still stings like a wound, Rome tried to forget, but never fully could. They called her many things: a harlot, a seductress, a disgrace, a danger. But they never called her what she truly was: a warning. Because to tell the story of Messalina only through the lens of lust is to willingly ignore the deeper truth that terrified Rome far more than her lovers, her appetite, or her fall. That she understood power, and she used it the only way the empire ever gave a woman permission to: through the body they claimed to own, through the silence they expected her to keep, through the rituals of beauty and desire that were supposed to make her controllable, not dangerous. And yet, she was dangerous. Not because she broke the rules, but because she understood them. Because she played Rome's game better than most men around her, navigated its jealousies, exploited its hypocrisies, predicted its reactions. And for years, she succeeded in a court that consumed its own with terrifying efficiency. She survived not because she was noble, but because she was clever. She ruled not from the throne, but from the shadows. And she fell not because she was evil, but because she made the one fatal mistake that every powerful woman in history eventually does. She became visible. When she was quiet, they tolerated her. When she was useful, they praised her. When she was beautiful, they adored her. But when she acted on her own terms, when she stopped apologizing, stopped hiding, stopped pretending, Rome did what patriarchies always do when confronted by a woman who refuses to bend. It didn't argue. It didn't debate. It erased. And we are left with fragments. Stories written by men who feared her. Histories filtered through disgust, panic, moralism, and shame. Sculptures destroyed. Scrolls rewritten. Memory burned in the name of morality. But look closer. Beyond the smear, beyond the gossip, beyond the dagger, and you'll see a different kind of story. Not of a woman who was too lustful, but of a world too terrified of what she represented. A woman who lived inside the machinery of empire and dared to pull the levers herself. A woman who weaponized the very tools meant to keep her docile. A woman who refused to be just a name on a family tree or a quiet handmaiden to history. And for that, she died. Alone, unburied, unnamed, but not forgotten. Because Messalina didn't die a whore. She died a symbol, a sacrifice to the order that feared her freedom, and a mirror for every generation that came after. I don't tell this story to redeem Messalina. I tell it because we need to remember what happens when we build systems that demand silence from those born outside the center of power, and what it costs when someone like her refuses to stay quiet. Her name became a weapon long after her body turned to dust. And yet, she is still here. In the stories we whisper, in the metaphors we misuse, in every woman taught to fear her own ambition, and in every voice punished not for lying, but for speaking at all. If this story moved you, challenged you, or made you see history differently, please consider subscribing to our channel. We tell the stories that were buried, the voices that were silenced, and the truths that power tried to erase. Subscribe now for more true stories of forgotten queens, cursed bloodlines, and the high cost of being unforgettable. Because sometimes, the most dangerous thing you can do is simply exist.